Welcome, welcome, welcome. Hey, James, how you doing?
Been fantastic. How are you, Brandon?
Pretty good. How's your week been going? Well, how's your month been going? It's been about a month since we did our last one, right?
Yeah, it's been a long month. A lot of work achieved. Watching all the interesting things happening on the internet about cyber attacks, ransomware, malware. I mean, it just never wants to stop.
Yeah, data breaches, kind of all the things that are happening, right? We're seeing more and more. And it's just pretty crazy. I mean, it's good that we have two experts that are going to be on the show today to talk about, governance and policies when looking at CMMC. And then we got eSentire on today. So a lot of good conversations going to happen today. Now, just a little housekeeping for you guys. We'll get started in a couple minutes. Just make sure you invite your colleagues, your friends of this. This is a cybersecurity defense in depth. We have experts on the show that you can ask live questions for, like in real time. So anything that you're thinking about when it comes to cybersecurity, about the technologies, the governance, make sure you ask lots of questions. These guys are here to help you in your company, your organization, as well as kind of your path in cybersecurity. So, James, anything that you wanted to cover today? I didn't know if there was any announcements.
Well, there's more than enough announcements that are actually floating out there, but really, I think I'm going to hold off until our next session in June. We've got a lot of interesting things that are developing. We are looking at exploring some great features with many of the viewers here today. But we will reach that point. But you know what? I'm looking forward to the show. And again, our presenters are fantastic. They're going to be covering relevant topics on ransomware, as well as the cybersecurity maturity model certification. So just looking forward to the show, and should be great.
Awesome. Well, let's jump in. I'll introduce our two speakers for today, and then we'll get started. So let me bring this up here. So today we're going to have Chris Golden and Mark Zangster, and they're going to be our speakers for today. Chris has been on before talking about CMMC. Just give me a second here. This is just changing. And we're going to have, like I said, two presenters. This meetup is live recorded and live streamed, so you guys can watch it later on YouTube or any of your social channels. You can watch it, I think, on Facebook, Twitch, as well as on YouTube later. It's going to be actually recorded and posted up there. So you guys, if you miss it, you have to go. Please watch the full thing. There's going to be a lot of great information. Also, just as a reminder, there's going to be the availability to ask Q&A as we go. Both speakers would love to have your live questions. So our first speaker is going to be Mark. Mark's answer is the author of No Safe Harbor, The Inside Truth About Cyber Crimes and How to Protect Your Business. He's an award-winning speaker in international conferences and prestigious stages, including the Harvard Law School and RSA conferences. An author of various subjects related to cybersecurity, his thought-provoking work and perspective on shifting risk trends that has influenced industry thought leaders, and is a go-to subject matter expert for leading publications and media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, when covering major data breach events. Our next speaker, which you guys already know, if you haven't watched in the previous, is Chris Golden. He's a retired colonel from the USAF. He spent over 2 decades in uniform in various flying, staff, and command assignments. He's retired and moved on to work cybersecurity for Wall Street and runs cybersecurity for Blue Cross Blue Shield. He is a founding board member of the Cmmc AB, a non-for-profit organization dedicated to implementing the CMMC program for the DoD. Chris holds an undergrad degree in computer science from the University of Miami and 2 master's degrees. Additionally, he holds many industry certifications such as CISSP, CISA, and a certified blockchain security professional. He has published and spoke on third-party risk management and is considered an international expert on the topic. In his spare time, Chris enjoys flying. He Yak 52 and scuba diving. And also, if you want to ask him a lot of questions about Star Wars. We were talking about that before this. All right, Mandalorian, things along that line. He loves to answer those questions. So that's our introduction for our speakers right now. Just give me a second here. Let me bring this up. So let me bring in Mark and let's get started. Hey, Mark, you ready to go?
All set. Thanks very much.
Here we go.
Terrific. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining tonight. And I'm going to spend about maybe 30 to 40 minutes talking about defending against ransomware, and then to obviously talk about what we can do. And as we go along here, please ask questions. I know you've got the ability to do this through the portal. I think that's fantastic, so we can deal with them real time. And if not, we'll definitely get to them afterwards. And I do encourage you to reach out later on at any time if you do have any questions or additional information. And I have to say, I'm actually quite interested in hearing Chris's presentation around CMMC, because that's certainly something that we are seeing within our customer base, even outside of the DoD, with municipalities, utilities, some healthcare facilities, and so on, who are also looking at how they can use that as a framework to protect their organization. And supply chain, of course, is critical. So I'll give you a couple of words just very quickly on eCentaur and where I come from. So I'm the industry security strategist. I work primarily in finance, healthcare, legal, in manufacturing as well. And I look at a lot of the data, the telemetry, the threat information that we collect through our security operations centers. I'm looking for trends. I'm looking for the kind of standouts that help me teach about the risk, right? Help them understand what the threats look like, that they're not as simplistic as they probably assume they are. And then now that they know that, build out the right kind of risk model that they need, put together the right kind of program to protect their businesses. So we draw telemetry from all sorts of various signals, right? Endpoint, cloud, network, etc. Now we pull that into our SOAR platform. So effectively we correlate. It allows us to analyze that information, and we have invested in machine learning, and I think it has its place. It does not replace people. Effectively, what it does allow us to do is, as we deal with the exponential growth in the signals that we have to deal with, it allows us to cut out a lot of the false positives. It also does a good job of investigating what on the surface looks like legitimate behavior. So when we're talking about criminals using remote administrative tools, for example, and they're creating new user accounts and promoting their creds and so on, that kind of stuff does look legitimate on the surface, or at least to the naked eye. But when we dig down to the microscopic level, we can detect things that indicate to us that it's malicious. In those cases, our human experts then investigate. They will then take action to contain. So it's not alerting. They're blocking traffic, quarantining devices, and so on. And it's they've got a sort of a litany of arsenal based on what they can do and how far they can deep dive with our clients. The point is, we are going from response through remediation. We're doing this within 35 seconds. Usually it's 15 minutes to containment. The final sort of 5 to 10 minutes is typically actually working with the client on post-event forensics, remediation recommendations, those that were affected, and also providing reports. So generally they have to send upwards, right? Because when something significant has happened, they generally have a C-suite that wants to know about it, wants to understand how it got in, how it was detected within seconds, and how it was stopped. So I will be drawing from a bunch of the data and some of the stories that we see in the Security Operations Center. From here on, let's just talk about ransomware and what we need to do about it. So another company that I work with is a company called Coalition, and they're an insurer that specifically focuses in cyber insurance tools and products. And it's no surprise in 2020 that we saw a massive increase in the number of attacks, and they really came through two fundamental channels. The one, of course, is business email compromise, fraudulent wire transfers, spoofing the boss, pick your name, but effectively they saw a significant increase in those, with almost a doubling in the amount of frauds that were, or funds that were defrauded, and the claims that were being made. Now, more importantly, or more relevantly, on the ransomware side, again, we saw significant increases, and not only increases in the volume of attacks, but also in the demands for payments, right? So we have seen that increase go from, let's say, 4 digits to, in some cases, well, in many cases 6, in some cases 7. I think there was one case of a law firm on the East Coast that has a bunch of celebrity A-listers as clients. When they were compromised, that information was stolen and they were shut down with ransomware. They wanted a $46 million ransom, which I just find amusing, because most law firms are never going to come up with that kind of money, nor were the insurers. But nonetheless, there was still, of course, the reputational damage that was done there, the publicity surrounding it, and so on. And that's very difficult for a law firm that is based on trust. That reputation is paramount, particularly in a firm like that where it's a small group, because that is they don't necessarily have the funds to absorb that kind of hit, and that means they'll probably scatter over time, which is extremely unfortunate. Now, that's their data, but I'll show you ours for a minute. And we take, as I said, we take the billions of signals we deal with, we aggregate that down, and more importantly, I look for the trends, right? So I'm less interested in how many servers weren't patched properly and more about what we're seeing. And from a mid-sized market issue, one of the big challenges I have, and it's actually why I wrote the book, was that a lot of these companies simply just don't see themselves as a target, right? They're in a geolocation they think isn't on the map for the bad guys, or their zip code or their postal code. They don't think they have assets worth stealing because they're not a financial institution. And they don't understand that data is a currency and it can be resold, or it can be used in a, sort of, let's call them third-party crimes, as in they steal the information from you and they use that to defraud someone else. And they haven't really worked that out. And they don't also understand that those state-sponsored actors will actually target them. Right now, they are targeting them for perhaps ideological reasons, or they're just trying to sow havoc, or frankly, they're funding their operations. And why not? It works, right? On one level or the other, it creates that kind of instability, that gray zones, that what we would have called enemies, but we're not actually in a state of war with them, so they're not. Those kind of countries, right? China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and Syria, and so on. They can still create an economic advantage here. And in the cases where, frankly, they can't go head-to-head on the battlefield, this is great guerrilla warfare tactics. Of course, organized crime has also bloomed. And what we're seeing now is a rise of malware as a service, right? Ransomware as a service. The concept of, you've got a really useful tool. I'm going to buy your malware. We'll do revenue sharing. I'll give you a cut, or whatever it might be. And there's a lot of evidence of that. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. The attacks are invested attacks, so hands-on keyboard, living out the land, and I'll show you an example in a minute. And the other more disturbing trend that I see is what I call cultural-based attacks, or industry-based attacks. And those are the ones where they now understand what it looks like to be a participant in your industry, right? So they understand the influence. They understand the regulators, for example. They know who the gorillas are, right? Who are the key players? They understand the challenges you have and the business drivers you have. And because of that, they can craft really clever, legitimate looking lures to snag you, right? So this isn't your generic kind of spoofing. This isn't a streaming service. This isn't an online retailer, a travel agency, or anything like that. And they do certainly run the gambit. We have seen things like, I sort of joke, for the high net wealth individuals, where they have access to premium credit cards like American Express, that they'll get those. They get the phishing lures that are, the special deals to attend the Fire Festival or Fire Festival 2.0. And of course that, plays to ego. But I'm talking about something that's a little more sophisticated than that. And I'll show you a few examples in a few slides along from now. Now, for those of you who have seen this, and this is a gross oversimplification, but I want to make the point here that this is a vested attack, right? So it starts with the generic things, regardless of whether or not it's a simple, if it were a Netflix or Hulu type of phishing lure, they're getting you to open something, to click on something, to download a document, to visit a site, and so on. Now, everybody sees this as a kind of as a fire and forget kind of approach, right? You've clicked on something that activates the malware life cycle. So that payload is downloaded, it locks your computer, and then you get a message, demanding a ransom to get the decryption keys for those files. But that's not the case, right? That is in some of the cases, but frankly, that's background radiation of the internet. In many cases, they're validating accounts, they're harvesting credentials, they're using those credentials to access your own environment through your own security controls, like a VPN. And then they're using remote administrative tools. So whether it's Microsoft RDP, or it's PowerShell, or it's a third-party tool, whatever it might be, they're using that to then move laterally within your environment, right? To affect and control administrative systems. So disabling defenses as an example, deploying other forms of malware. So it could be things like credential harvesting tools, or banking Trojans, or whatever it might be. They now can move around to some degree with impunity. And of course, while they're doing this, they're also deploying ransomware throughout the organization, potentially including backups. While they're doing this, they're also exfiltrating data. So anything they see is valuable. And in a lot of these industries that I work with, they know what to look for. In a law firm, they know to go to the document management system, because that's the thing that has all the gold. Or they want to get into the time tracking system because that has all the account information and they're both tied together. So they know they can get the names of clients and other attorneys that they're working with, the name of judges in cases, and all sorts of useful information when it comes to duping those organizations into surrendering money through fraud. And then, of course, now that they've done this, they're looking for a significantly larger payout, right? So we're not talking about cryptocurrency equivalents of $500 or $5,000. We're now in the 500, 5 million kind of range. And of course, we've also seen a growth, and as have the insurers, in extortion fees, right? Now, ransom fees can be covered through insurance, and your policies and riders will vary on what will be covered and to how much and so on, and how you have to engage with the insurer to get that coverage. But we're also seeing extortion fees. And so this is the notion of, well, now that you paid us to get your files back, or you're never getting your files back, but here's what we do want. We want money to keep it quiet, right? The hush kind of money. And we saw some of the larger companies that were hit in the last couple of years, of course, in some cases paying them. Back at the beginning of 2020, there was a currency exchange company that made that mistake and for months posted signs on their website that said that they were down for scheduled maintenance, which of course was ridiculous because it never goes on that long, only to find out that they had been paying and they were attempting to avoid the public wrath of a massive breach, which is ultimately where they are. And of course, now this is in the UK. So the Information Commissioner's Office, so their privacy arm, is now investigating them. And as we're going to hear from Chris, and I think this is really, really exciting, is vendor risk, supply chain risk, whatever you want to call it, third-party risk, has actually become one of the biggest vectors and one of the greatest threats, I think, to most organizations, right? So as an initial view into your organization, this is a great way for criminals to go. And there was a lot of hype around SolarWinds, and depending on SolarWinds Orion, and depending on the size of the organization, varies to whether or not they were using those kind of tools. And the smaller to mid-size, they weren't. But then they hit what I call infrastructure tools, right? So Microsoft Exchange and the vulnerabilities there with Hafnium's attack and the ability to deploy web shells. So there's an interesting point here. When I talked about industry sort of socialization, right? Social engineering 2.0. So the cultural stuff, knowing what your specific business looks like. There's also another way to go, which is going after infrastructure, right? The sort of the technology infrastructure. Because when you think about risk, you can either eliminate risk, right? You can not participate in it. You can mitigate what's there, what you can, or you have to accept the risk, right? And generally the acceptance comes after you've attempted to mitigate as much as you can. Well, at the end of the day, you can't turn off infrastructure, right? You have to have that to conduct any form of business, and they recognize that. So these types of organizations, I think, will only continue to be under target, and your supply chain in general will, whether you're downstream or upstream. So I'm really looking forward to what Chris is going to talk about here. And to give you an idea of how serious it is, just a month ago, the Department of Justice actually sought a court order to have the FBI unilaterally patch and update systems that were still vulnerable and still exposed. Now, there's lots to talk about there. There are lots, all the privacy lawyers were abuzz, of course, when this happened. And, I don't really want to go down that avenue and talk about what that looks like. But the reality is this has got to be pretty serious when the DOJ is willing to potentially take the kind of public fire that they would over this kind of brash move. So, there's obviously more that they know that we don't see from their sort of satellite view altitude. And that's good, right? I think there's a certain point of we do need to trust this. And we should also recognize in this, of course, what the risk looks like and how severe the risk is. Because in this case, supply chain is actually one of the biggest factors that we've seen. I conducted some research about a year ago where I interviewed 650 different organizations and their execs and found that about half of them had actually sustained what they consider to be a material breach. Now, what that means to them and what that means to you and I may vary, but the point is they saw it as significant enough to report it in that vein. And I mentioned the industrialization of crime. I talked about organized criminals and ransomware as a service. And we work with several different endpoint companies and through joint research and analysis of the threat analytics that we have, we've seen a significant growth in this kind of market. Like I said, through revenue sharing and also through customization of tools. So if they know they're going after a specific type of business, they may adapt their tools and their approach to the campaign to make sure that it aligns and it has a higher chance of actually of succeeding, right? And when they do this as well, of course, as I said, it's hands-on keyboard. It's not a singularity. It's not a single step event that's set and forget. And they will spend time trying to counter whatever incident response measures you take and you put in place. And often in some of these cases, when we defend them, we find that we're in there for hours fighting with them. And it is that kind of whack-a-mole type of situation as we're going back and forth with them. And then, of course, we spend days after that monitoring to determine whether or not they come back. And it's certainly not for the faint of heart. And it certainly shows a complexity and a tenacity. And I think that's what's more concerning, is once they recognize that you are a target and you have something they want to steal, they will keep coming until they're successful. So I'll show you a few examples here as we go now. I'm just going to show you, I think, 2 or 3 around what we've seen with some of these ransomware gangs. So Soden, or our evil group, we found them targeting a group of mid-sized firms, some law firms, manufacturer, construction company, and so on. And of course, as proof of their cheeky activity, they also published it so that we could see their files. And this is a fairly common thing. Now, I think depending on the type of business that they've targeted, as I said, reputational risk may be more paramount to them. And in those cases, they know exposing this information does 2 things. 1, obviously, it's going to damage their reputation. But 2, they may have licensing obligations. So in law, for example, they absolutely do. Now in architecture and construction, it'll depend the information and whether or not it harms the client and so on. But all the licensed practitioners, lawyers, doctors, accountants, engineers, architects, and so on, generally have an ethical component to their license. And they usually have some kind of continuing education element as well to ensure that they keep up to pace with the various changes in technology and the risks that come from the threat landscape. So they know there's also not only a corporate element here, but there's a personal element. And in fact, in one case, I've talked to a few lawyers who are concerned about this, because what they're seeing is in smaller firms that the lawyers are using malpractice insurance to attempt to make their clients whole when there has been damage from a cyber attack. And from the insurance perspective, because I've talked to them, they're really concerned about this because they're going to tap out the cash reserves that are there. They're going to burn them out. They're going to drive premiums up. And what it means is that a lot of lawyers, particularly the ones starting out, either will not have coverage, won't have sufficient coverage, or can't get it at all, right? And I mean, this is a real challenge now. And in fact, in some cases, some of the smaller firms I've worked with are actually trying to figure out how they can merge with a group or create some kind of coalition so they can get themselves to the point where they have enough critical mass to actually defend themselves, right? So they have enough resources where they feel they have more budget allocation, where they look big enough, they can deal with things like meet specific standards so that they can then land those larger clients that are beholden to regulators and do have to meet specific guidelines. And the second one that we saw that was similar to this was Bootloader poisoning various websites, and they had created pages with resources, tools, and templates, and so on, again, built for professionals. And in this case, what they were doing is, you have a doctor, for example, who sets up their practice with their partners, and they're trying to figure out, well, how much do we pay our administrative support? Or how much should we be paying for this technology? Or what kind of insurance do we need to carry? All those kind of questions, all the things that don't get covered in whatever school you went to, law school, med school, whatever it might be. And this was actually, we believe, was actually collected from looking at search results. So they were trying to determine what it was that these people were looking for. Based on that, they created what they thought were attractive targets or lures so that these individuals would click. And of course, they were all weaponized, and they were downloading ransomware or banking Trojans, as I said, or other tools to collect and harvest credentials. And this one came more recently. And this is one that, again, highlights a risk that many organizations have to face depending on the industry in which they operate. So this was a case where a criminal group was attempting to defraud several law firms and some clients based on publicly available information about a court settlement. So the nature of our judicial system is open, right? We do share this. Judges' decisions are public. Specific information within the court system is made public, is filed publicly, and so on. You can't avoid that risk. Again, this is back to when I talked about attacks on infrastructure like Office 365 as an example, and Microsoft Exchange. We have to have that to do our business. We cannot turn off that form of digital electricity. And they recognize that. So it's a vulnerability and it's an exposure within our industry. And they're starting to figure out how to exploit that. You can't turn this off. So it's always going to be there. So now the question is, how do you do a better job of ensuring that you are making legitimate payments versus these fraudulent ones? So this one, in this case, we did actually catch it, but we caught it for other reasons. We didn't catch it because of the nature of the information in the emails. It was actually quite legitimate. They had all the right information. So again, it just becomes harder with the naked eye to detect legit from unauthorized activity. And that's just a couple of examples. There are plenty of them, right? We've seen licensed practitioners attacked as through a fake complaint against their license, right? You're a lawyer and somebody's suing you, or you're a doctor and you're being sued for malpractice, and so on. But in another case, what I saw that was quite interesting was a criminal group that posed as a, in this case, it was a law student from a very prestigious school on the East Coast. And they were looking for a mentor as part of their academic program. So they befriended some judges, they befriended a couple of senior managing partners, and after they had had communications with them back and forth for several weeks, all of which looked legit. So my suspicion is they either were a law student at some point, are a law student, or they know one, because they had a lot of good insider information. They knew how to pose as one. And of course, once they had gone through this fake relationship, they then flipped them a link and said, hey, would you be as kind as to click on this link and complete the survey so that I can get academic credit? And yes, you guessed it, that then deployed ransomware or a loader to deploy ransomware. It's no shock. So one of the best defenses that we can use against this is phishing training and testing. And security awareness training, to me, starts at the top and goes right to the bottom of the organization. Each level of the organization may face slightly different threats. Executives have access to all sorts of information across the company. They also often, because of seniority, have administrative rights or privileges that they shouldn't, because they don't relate to what they do on a daily basis. But you know what? They're a senior person in the room, so they get them. And of course, that leads to attacks, right? That sort of thing can be exploited. So they all need slightly different training. The lures should vary if you're doing testing, but creating that general awareness does two things. One, the first thing is that it informs, right? People now know what the threats look like. They don't think they're looking for the ridiculous email that says, hey, go buy a bunch of Home Depot gift cards and let me know when you've done that, or Netflix telling them that their credit card was rejected and they have to now enter a new form of payment. They realize it's a lot more sophisticated. They also recognize, depending on what they're dealing with on a daily basis, that they may have to up their vigilance because perhaps you're working with clients or you're now in a supply chain that's under threat. And because of that, you have to do your job to protect them. And the second element of this, of course, is that it also brings them into the fold, right? This isn't security that's a pain in the butt. It's not an inconvenience. It's not yet another bulletin that they have to read. They now recognize and understand why it is they need to do this, why it's so critical that, for example, when they receive a request through email, that they pick up the phone, particularly when we work in a remote model, because that's one of the key reasons why the fraud levels went up so badly in 2020, because you couldn't walk down the hall and lean in somebody's office and say, hey, did you really want me to transfer those funds? It became a lot harder to do remotely, especially for a lot of us who just sort of became insular introverts and hid in our basements. And criminals understand that. And there's another point of phishing testing that I think this one hits home here, right? When you don't do testing, about 40%, 4 in 10 people are going to click, right? After you've done testing, if you test again 90 days later, only 1.5 in 10 click, right? And then half do, right? At this point, you've got a order of magnitude reduction in your risk simply by doing this. And I work with a lot of clients, and we do these monthly, and we'll see trends over time as well, where the threats go up and down. right? And they are seasonal attacks, right? So tax time is a good one. Back to school is a good time. Of course, we saw all the pandemic stuff last year, elections stuff as well, and the holidays, right? They're not stupid. They know when to attack. We dealt with one organization that had to deal with a ransomware attack. And of course, this individual received the message on the late afternoon, right before the Thanksgiving holiday. Went, yeah, okay, I'll deal with that when I get back. Took Thursday off, took Black Friday off, came back after the weekend. And of course, by the time he had, everything had been destroyed. And he didn't even have a copy of the ransom message. Now, this was a small firm that actually lost all of its data because its backups didn't work and it had never tested. And they ended up having to go back to paper and pen, pull through files, email that they could recover from the cloud, and determine what they could actually sort of cobble back together. So it was a disaster for the organization, a very expensive, painful lesson learned. But for the rest of us, we can learn from this. Obviously, backups should be working and tested. But the other part of this is that they know when to strike, and they know when to do this when you're at your least attentive time. So I talked earlier about how attacks are not a singularity. And when I conduct awareness training, one of the messages I want to get across is before you even see a lure, before you even receive an email, they've already been sniffing your trail and they're already kind of hunting your tracks. So they will collect information from all sorts of macro sources, right? The news, they're looking at regulators, industry influencers. They're looking for changes in tax laws, for example, because they know that's when there's the flurry of activity. And that's a time that they can piggyback on that, right? They can steal one of those tax documents, they can repackage it, they can add a script to it, and they fire it off to you. And because it's relevant, it's context relevant, because it's timely, that's something that you have a higher likelihood of clicking on. So they start with the basics, they socially engineer, but then they're pulling in other information that's available. Threat intelligence, credentials that have already been stolen, hijacked documents, like I said, that now they know how they can use them. They can say, you know what, I know who would click on that, now I'm going to use it. Or the example I gave you of the sites that had been poisoned, where they're creating these kind of chimera sites and trying to lure you to them in the hopes that you'll find something valuable there and you'll click. All of this is built to create a tailored campaign. And then they're going to use the hijack credentials that they've collected from that activity. And they may not be yours. This is a good point to remember. They could be somewhere else in the supply chain. They could be your vendors. They could be one of your clients as well coming in. So now it's coming from a legitimate email source. It is coming from John Smith or Jane Smith, and it's coming to you. And when it comes with one of these attachments that you know made sense because perhaps this is part of the deal that you're doing, it's let's say you're in manufacturing and it's design drawings, right? You're going to click on that stuff. It gets a lot harder for you to recognize as I said, as malicious and illegitimate. Now, once they do this, they will also enter through multiple vectors. And this is why, as they engineer a company, they may be stealing multiple sets of creds because they know one or two might get hit. So, I just watched the Steve McQueen movie, The Great Escape. And, in that they build 3 tunnels. So they dig 3 tunnels, Tom, Dick, and Harry, right? Because they're trying to escape the camp during their prisoners of war during World War II. And they know that it's likely that their captors may actually find one of them or 2 of them. So they didn't put all their eggs in one basket. And it's the same thing. That's exactly what the criminals are doing. But it works twofold, because just like that movie, the guards have to work even harder to be vigilant, right? To figure out what the prisoners are up to, and are they digging tunnels, and where are they hiding the dirt, and where are they getting the wood to shore up the tunnels, and so on, right? They know the more that they have to deal with, the more potential areas for escape, the more guards they need, the more vigilant they need, more towers they need, and spotlights, and so on. And it's the same thing. So the criminals are doing the same idea here, right? They're spreading out, they're moving around. They found more than one entrance in, more than one window that hasn't been locked properly, and off they go. They use your own tools, like I said. They enter through your own security systems. They'll use a remote administrative tool, pick your flavor, to get into the system, create new accounts. From there, they'll use PowerShell as an example, and then they're deploying whatever. In this case, it was Mimikatz in the first go round. So they were actually looking to harvest credentials and drop in, or they wanted a payloader. That was detected. Then they flipped to a second system. They created different accounts. We saw this again, and they started with a new flavor of ransomware. Again, we were able to stop this, at which point they pivoted, they tried a third vector, and they used a well-known flavor of ransomware, NetWalker. And it's kind of interesting because we suspect that the behavior was a bit like They were a little clumsy in places, so it's almost like, you know, the gang trying to prove itself with some street cred by, you know, committing the crime to prove to the big gang that they're worthy, and they want to be, you know, sort of made men like in the mob. And of course, when that didn't work, then they fell back and they used ransomware as a service and literally bought a successful version off the shelf to revenue share. Now, again, in all these cases, we did detect them and stop them. But there's a complexity to this. And as I said, there's a tenacity, right? They don't stop. They will continue through multiple vectors, and companies need to be prepared. So if I turn to that, how do you stand your ground when it comes to this? There is no straight answer, or easy answer, I should say. It is complicated. There are lots of vectors, and yes, I want to avoid every cliche I can, but, you know, defense in depth and so on. But let's take a look again at these various steps. The social engineering step, this is where acceptable usage policies, awareness training can be critical, right? They can reduce your risk. Knowing what you can share, oversharing on social media, oversharing in marketing media. That's a big one we don't look at. One company I worked with was defrauded of $2 million out of the $10 million in venture capital funding that they received after publishing their press release. A lot of companies are going to do it. But at the same time, you have to recognize nowadays there's risk around that. I worked with one firm, it's a manufacturing company, where the CEO decided to take a stand on a political issue 2-3 years ago. And when they did, shortly after that, one of the control systems on the assembly line was compromised and was actually deploying malware towards their head office, just them. So it's hard not to think that that wasn't retaliatory, and it was incredibly expensive. They had to endure that for a period of time before they actually got into a scheduled maintenance window and were able to shut down. So, you know, is it worth it? You know, I'm not taking away anyone's free speech, but you do have to consider the role you play as an executive and an employee in the company. And the more senior you are, the bigger the target value you have, which means there's going to be a lot more bullseyes on you. Now, as we move into initial access, and now they're trying to use these stolen creds, they're phishing to pick up creds. You know, in a lot of cases, phishing testing, awareness training, using multi-factor authentication can reduce this risk. It doesn't eliminate it, but it reduces a bunch of it. And as they start to move in, things like identity and access management. So if you're using multiple services, cloud, for example, administrative privileges, the number of companies is like, turn it off. Like, most of the people that work there don't need the kind of privileges that they've been given. And when it comes to dealing with critical systems, using something like privilege access management as an example, using some kind of vault where the task and the access to that critical system is time-based and task-based and can be trackable through ticketing and then eliminated. This means that the criminals who are coming in through a remote administrative tool like PowerShell don't have the ability to create persistence the way they would when you have a flat environment. Segmenting your environment is another huge piece, right? Where they've come in from one vector and one area and they cannot move into another, particularly critical systems. So if we think about manufacturing and healthcare, right? Segmentation in healthcare is absolutely critical. Unfortunately, it doesn't always happen. We see this, right? Things get plugged into the wrong ports all the time. Or as the institution grows, they start cutting corners. And in particular, doing things like COVID, where they're all, you know, they're completely overtasked and under-resourced, under-budgeted, and so on. People just cut corners and they do what they can to survive. And unfortunately, you sort of fall down that Maslow's hierarchy back to that level, and criminals can exploit that. Now, as they start to move inside your environment, like I said, certain machine learning and threat intelligence tools provide value. Endpoint, particularly in a remote model. Obviously, in 2020, endpoint became and some form of remote access control. So whether it was a VPN or an SD-WAN or software-defined perimeter tool, whatever it is, these things became critical. And for the companies that we worked with, a lot of them had this, so it was kind of business as usual. Maybe the volumes of traffic went up, so backhauling was a bit of a pain in the butt. But for the most part, it was okay. And then, of course, there's monitoring, right? All these systems are really great, but one of the big things you see in security is they tend to be isolated, siloed kind of services. So you're taking this telemetry from everywhere. And yeah, it might be feeding a SIM as an example, but it's not truly correlated. It's not aggregated. You're not looking at what the left hand is doing to figure out and what the right hand is doing to determine what your risk level looks like. And is there something going on in your environment that needs to be investigated? So having a SOC or having some kind of 24/7 type of monitoring service will provide that, whether they're managing your SIM or they're managing other services to include things like cloud-based systems, endpoint, logging, and so on. And of course, as is part of any regulatory compliance model, right, is having your IR program and plan in place. And there's lots of things to consider there, right? Is it a retainer? Do you have a plan? How do you practice it? How do you engage the executives and so on? But having that in place and knowing what to do in those circumstances, I should say, is critical. Backups and restore, obviously. Paying the ransom has become a big issue that we've had to deal with, and I'm going to save that for the next slide, as is insurance claims. And working with law enforcement and insurance agencies, the one thing I can tell you is call them. Call them often, call them early. In fact, call them before anything happens, right? Everyone sort of sees them as the 911, and we dial them after something's happened. But they don't have to be. They can be proactive as well, right? So bringing in your insurer as part of awareness training on an annual basis is an example. Bringing in law enforcement, right? So that could be the Secret Service, the FBI, your local municipal law enforcement agency, if they have a cyber arm and so on, are useful. When you've got contact numbers, it's not 911. Right? It's knowing who to call. And frankly, having names on business cards is even more critical. If you can pick up the phone and you know Special Agent Jane Smith, that's great, right? Because you've got a faster inroad here. And we know there's the kind of the golden hours, right? There's that 24 to 72 hours, depending on the type of event you're dealing with, particularly with fraudulent wire transfers as an example. That's critical, because within a certain time, depending on international destinations, they may be able to stop or recover some of those funds. But if you wait a week, if you try to deal with it on your own for a couple of weeks and suddenly realize that this is above your pay grade and you come back for help, you're in trouble. They may not be able to do that. The other thing too is to understand through your insurance claims, or your insurance policy, exactly what's covered and what your minimum security standards are, and also what you're obligated to do in those events. When do you have to notify them, and what do you have to provide? And that actually becomes a real trick. And it's the same thing when we look across a supply chain, for example, because you have to understand what your obligations are as part of that supply chain. It's not just you. It's the damage that can be done upstream or downstream. And you have to understand where you are in that and what you need to do in these situations, what you have to collect, who you have to report it to, and how quickly you have to do that. And then, of course, there's the other pieces. There's the threat feeds that we can look at, and there's the threat hunting, right? And we have a group that's actually out there doing that, right? That is looking. And this is sort of some newer areas, and threat feeds, yes, have been around a long time. But what I'm talking about is that kind of active hunting where people are looking for compromised information. They're looking for patterns of attack, and so on. And all of this kind of loops back right to the beginning and having a proper risk model, right? So understanding what assets you have, what obligations you have because of those assets, prioritizing the risks, and of course, building a plan to mitigate or reduce those risks. So I talked about paying ransoms, and this has become a very sticky area. In a lot of cases, I've seen smaller firms pay them. I've seen them negotiate it. Insurers will absolutely negotiate them. They know how to deal with it. But at the end of last year, the Department of Treasury issued a couple of advisories. One was that companies that engage in that sort of activity have to register, and they have to register the suspicious activity, just like a bank would if somebody walks in every week with a backpack full of cash. That doesn't look legit, and if that's going on, they have to report it. So it's the same idea. But the other piece, and I think this is a more critical piece, is that you have to ensure, or you should be ensuring, that the recipient of funds, if you determine that you want to pay, are not on what's called the OFAC list, or the Office of Foreign Assets Control, because effectively we're not allowed to trade with those parties. They could be terrorists, enemies of the state, and so on. You have to have permission to do that. So in those cases, again, technically they could lay criminal charges. Are they going to? I highly doubt it. But I think it's important for you to understand that. That becomes part of the incident response plans that you put in place. That's the discussion you have with the insurers and law enforcement. Working with law enforcement, does it eliminate that risk? No. But there's certainly been a lot of overtures from Treasury that if you've engaged with law enforcement, if you are working with them and you find themselves in a position where you have no choice but to pay, that they will seek leniency in that case. And I think this is the point, right? It's the reasonable man's argument here. Did you take reasonable care? Right? Would the common man have made these decisions? If you're a small regional hospital and you've been shut down and your only choice is to pay, that's probably a legitimate decision to make and the right one. And they will look on that favorably. The point is, though, you really do have to consider this. And it's not just paying ransoms and it's not just paying insurance. But as we've seen now with several cases and precedents that have occurred in court decisions, that when it comes to any kind of after action event, if something does occur, something significant. So let's talk about lawsuits, for example. Your clients sue you. If that's the case, everything you do may be under the microscope. And a lot of companies generally try to set up their incident response plans through their legal counsel. And they do that because then they think that everything that's done through that communication conduit is privileged, as in it's under attorney-client privilege, which means it cannot be made public and it cannot be discovered as part of a court proceedings. That is not always true. And that was the case with Capital One, where the plaintiffs in the class action suit sued and wanted the incident response report as produced by Mandiant. And it turned out the judge has agreed to release it. And he's agreed to do this about almost a year ago now, based on a couple of things. One, the document had been shared like Halloween candy, so you can't really say it's privileged and confidential when pretty much everybody's seen it. But the other pieces that were more critical and more important as a lesson to learn here was that it was the way that it was accounted for. So it actually went under a cybersecurity budget, not a legal budget. And it also went under umbrella coverage that had been put into place 5-6 years before this event occurred. And they will look at these things to say, was this done in likelihood of legal action to make it privileged? Well, the short answer is no, it didn't. And for that reason, now we've seen multiple cases where these documents have become discoverable. They are the smoking gun, CCTV footage, confession, and eyewitnesses and fingerprints. It is all the forensics they need to convict. So you really do have to think about what you're doing, how you frame out those programs, and see it through and follow it through. And that's why it's critical to go right back to the beginning and plan. Assume something like this will occur, put the right controls in place, but also put your incident response in place because it likely will get used. So when it comes to protecting your organization, I think there's sort of 5 core areas here, plus the risk planning on top of that you need to think about. Right? Our risks don't just come from the bad guys, from the sophisticated threats. They also come from the technology that we adapt and adopt. As we bring in new technology that we understand not as well as incumbent tech, there is a risk associated, and accountability is going up. Reasonable care has increased. I've talked about insurance, regulators, standards like we see like CMMC are all raising the bar. So you need to see your entire environment. Protecting one piece of it is no good. If you're in a supply chain, it's got to be the whole supply chain, right? If you're a factory, you have to have the factory floor, not just the front office. If you're a hospital, it's got to be the med tech, not just, again, the administrative offices. And in doing that, of course, you have to deal with a lot more data, right? There's a lot more information. So you have to think about how do you take all those alerts? How do you aggregate them? How do you filter them? And you have to be able to do this quickly. All those attacks that I showed you, they happened within minutes and hours. They didn't take days or months or weeks, right? You need the expertise. Somebody's got to figure out how to stop it when they find it, right? Of course, like any risk program, right? There's the threat, there's the likelihood of the threat occurring, there's the cost of not mitigating it, and there's the cost of mitigating it. And the cost of mitigation cannot obviously be higher than the cost of the event itself. So you really have to, of course, work within those confines. Get asked that all the time. How much should we be spending on our budget? And then I sound like a lawyer because I say it depends. And of course, the risk management piece. And I think they go full circle because again, it's back to what do you know? What do you have? What do you have to protect? How have you prioritized that? And how are you protecting it? That's what matters, right? Because you can't stop everything. You're not going to be able to do that, but you have to show that you understood the risk and you took steps, reasonable care to reduce that risk, right? To try and minimize that threat. And that's what courts, that's what insurers and clients are looking for. So I'll leave you with one final thought here as we move into the second portion of tonight's, this evening's program. But it's the supply chain risk we've seen. Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities and SolarWinds Orion and so on. They're not the first, and they're certainly not going to be the last. And the standards and the bars to which we hold ourselves when it comes to cybersecurity continue to move, right? So, back on the tragic and horrific attacks on 2000 or 9/11 in 2001, security or continuity, business continuity, was sort of thought of as the physical facility, right? We have to protect those buildings, and that kind of got us partway. Well, then about a decade later, Hurricane Sandy, which was a Category 5 hurricane, the worst of the season, a little over that decade later, rolled up the same seaboard, flooded out Manhattan, New Jersey, and a whole bunch of areas. And what that taught us was business continuity and disaster recovery and backups don't work when they're across the Hudson River. While that's quite a large river and body of water, the reality is category hurricanes or hurricanes of that category, they can cross those state lines. They can hit those too. And so we had to think about being more separated geographically, having different virtual systems that we could use, and a stronger, more resilient model, right? So it changed. Actually, there's many court cases that were tested over this, and even the American Bar Association came out and said that, right? That effectively this changed the way we have to look at continuity planning and resilience. And then, of course, with the sheltering from home and remote workers that we saw en masse last year, it's the same thing. If you were prepared for that, I should say, it was business as usual. Yes, there was some heightened vigilance you had to have around themed attacks and so on. But the reality is you continue conducting business. For those organizations that refused or were not prepared, this was a tectonic shift for them. There was significant work and a significant window of risk. And that's why we saw those attacks increasing. Right. So again, we can invest from our future by learning from the past. The things we see today, the tools and technology we put in place to defend against ransomware today, they're good for now, but they will change. And we will introduce new risk, right? We'll bring in new tech. And the criminals will come up with better ways to exploit them, and tested through courts, through regulatory controls, through standards, through client obligations, and so on. Again, the bar will raise. So we always have to assume that cyber risk is not going away. If anything, it's going to continually increase. So gentlemen, I'll pass it back to you. I don't know if we had some questions come in, or we can just continue with the program.
No, actually we didn't. I'm going to actually ask you a few questions. I know one that came up for me is at one point when people were looking at reporting their incidents, there was a cliche or maybe even a recommendation that the FBI or someone was just saying, just pay it. Just pay it. Just pay it. You don't have to do remediation. Is that still the case? Is that what you're hearing?
No, I'm actually working right now on something with it's not the FBI, but with another law agency. And their recommendation right now is to contact them first before paying and to work with the insurer for a couple of reasons. One is obviously the recover of fraudulently stolen funds. But the other piece of that is that sometimes they have the decryption keys. Sometimes they've seen it and they know what to do to sort of reverse engineer it out, and they can fix it for you. Or conversely, they can basically say to you, yeah, you want to pay this one. Like, we're not going to, this isn't one we can help you recover from. They won't actually out and out recommend that. But it's a little bit of the, I guess you can sort of take silence as acquiescence there, right? When they don't have an alternative for you.
Right. Okay. Now with the pandemic, I saw the progression that you had with the chart, September 11th, really tragic. And then you had the Hudson River, and then you kind of went up. Aren't we seeing a increase like with the ransomware because of the pandemic and the exposure now with, because every company had kind of their internal environment. You're in kind of a silo, you worked in the corporation, maybe multiple sites, but now corporations have 100 different sites because there's 100 employees that are now working at their homes.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was lots of reasons why the threat and the risks increased. So, there's the very obvious ones, right? The attacks and the phishing campaigns and so on that used COVID-related information, right? Pretending to be an authority like a healthcare source or the World Health Organization or the CDC, providing heat maps of where could you travel safely or sort of safely, and where were no-fly zones and so on. And they could use that sort of that confusion and that thirst for information, right? Because particularly in the first few months, we were all, we had no idea what was going on, right? This is a once in a lifetime type of event. So we're all struggling to come to terms with it. And anything that could help us feel some sense of control was, of course, something that they were looking for. But the other part of this from a corporate perspective is, as you say, right, that mass distribution or migration to remote workers. That's going to cause its own set of confusion, right? People aren't as well versed. Normally they come into work and they sit down and they either plug in their laptop into a docking station or they off they go. And they don't know that there's now new steps. So if they don't understand them, like connecting through a VPN, for example, and why they need to. And then, of course, if companies haven't set it up so they can access critical systems still without doing it, things like that, not having two-factor or multi-factor authentication in place, that gave the criminals another opportunity, right, to exploit it. In fact, we certainly saw attacks where they posed as administrators, right? They came in as the IT department and said, hey, by the way, you need to do this, right? And they would pop up some, fake login page for Microsoft Office. And so you'd think you were logged out and you'd log back in. And of course, they were harvesting your credentials, but they'd also send your creds on to Microsoft. So you would log in and it looked like the expected outcome, right? So you didn't even know that it had happened. So even for the companies that had the right security controls in place, there was still that opportunity, right, through user error for people not knowing exactly what to do. And a lot of companies, even though they might have had these tools in place, their usage policies were kind of based on simplistic standards and they weren't tested. And then even for the advanced companies with SOCs and machine learning and all that kind of stuff, the baselines changed. The patterns of traffic that you'd be looking at on a day-to-day and looking for those spikes that, say there's something wrong, that the entire baseline changed. So you needed a period of time, 60, 90 days to let that level to now understand what it looked like. And, basic things like geo-blocking and a bunch of stuff that we relied on didn't necessarily work, particularly in larger companies where they have employees all around the globe.
Right. And I think one of the concerns that I've heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that because of the landscape's change, you have people who have families on the home network, husband, wife, significant other, little Jimmy, little Jane, right?
Yes.
They're on their Xboxes, PlayStations, and, they're on their iPads or smart devices, and they're clicking on clickbait, which then can bring malware into the network.
Yeah.
And then that VPN connection, yes, it's secure, but might have direct portal right into the actual company because little Jimmy brought in a malware unknowingly because he saw, some sort of clickbait about, hey, get this new app, and then all of a sudden, Minecraft, here's a new Minecraft, thing. He clicks on that, it's malware, goes to the network, and then it goes right through the whole network.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Right. In fact, I think I spent 2 months at the beginning dealing with, basic cybersecurity hygiene, right? So I'm not even talking, anything fancy, like here's these elaborate attacks they use. I'm talking about things like, change the administrative rights on your router at home, right? On whatever your ISP is supplied, because all that stuff is factory settings, is generic. Every bad guy out there knows what they are. Using encryption, changing the Wi-Fi address. Big one for people with children that was critical was, having a guest Wi-Fi account, so that, because you've got those teenage kids or your younger kids, their friends come over, they want to connect to the Wi-Fi, so they're not paying for data usage with their wireless supplier. And of course, they're on the same network that you're doing your banking and you're doing your work, right? And so it was critical to set up, just basic things that needed to be put in place. And most people don't understand that. And that's sort of outside the auspices of your sort of typical IT reach, right? So, you think about things like shadow IT, approved applications, controlled access, all the things you have in a corporate environment. Well, you can't force all of that stuff on somebody's home as well, right? So now the boundary really did gray there. There was no kind of air-gapped or demilitarized zone between the two. And that we saw a lot of issues with that, particularly in the beginning. And we spent a lot of time, like I said, helping companies just go through like the awareness of this is here's why you change this thing. And here's why you don't name your Wi-Fi your street address or your family surname or, things like that are really easy to identify if you're sniffing.
Right. Oh yeah. I mean, I used to do Bell Sympatical installation. So I saw crazy stuff like your dog's name. But then on Facebook, right, you see all their dog and
there's their dog. Yeah.
So, and as
Absolutely.
They can do just a quick search on someone's profile and go anniversary, favorite dog, favorite team, favorite this.
Yep.
okay, I'm going to just try some of these passwords and dates and times, and let's see if
100%.
we can get in, right?
Yeah,
So-
even in things like video conferencing tools, it was the same thing, and I'd warn people about what's in view on your screen. So one, making sure you actually share the application, right? And the application window, not a monitor, because a lot of times people have like multiple monitors. And so you stop sharing and you think you're not displaying anything, but you are. You're still displaying something on another screen. And if you're not paying attention, you might be showing confidential information. Or what's on your camera, right? Like what's in the background here.
Right.
And somebody goes, oh, Mark likes the space shuttle and NASA, so maybe I'll send him something. And you're right? There is that, sports teams, movies, memorabilia, things like that may be a little more obscure, where they suddenly go, oh, look, he's got a couple of Steve McQueen pictures up there. Maybe if I send some lure about, some deal on some, movie memorabilia, he might fall for it. And it allows them to socially engineer you, and you're of course volunteering it. And in cases I've actually seen
Steve
people
McQueen
have corporate
is an astronaut. Click here. You like what?
Yeah,
No
exactly.
way.
That's right. Absolutely. So, and confidential information. I had one person who had that up in the background. They had client account names and PII up there, and okay, it wasn't the end of the world, but it's like anybody on your calls, man, can read that stuff. And it's backwards, but easy enough to figure out, right? And
Take
they just take a screenshot. Exactly. And so you have to just be aware. And in fact, even in the legal community, the Bar Association put out warnings about listening enabled devices, right? You're sitting there on client calls and your watch or your Alexa or whatever is sitting there listening. So what's recorded, how are those recordings stored in the cloud, what are the confidentiality rights and protections around those kind of devices? Because if somehow that got out, your client doesn't care, and the bar associations don't care either, right? The simple fact is you did not protect your client's confidential information, and you've harmed the client, and that's a big no-no for them.
Now, last question before we kind of move on to Chris. You talked about cybersecurity awareness training. It's probably one of I find is one of the best, lowest investment in the sense of cost, but the highest rate of return, because if your team is actually trained top down, you can actually protect your environment a lot better versus technical controls, administrative controls, policies and procedures. If the people know not to click on something, my question to you is, who do you see as the worst case or worst, individual in the network? Because, and the reason why I want to throw this out there is because a lot of people think it's the lower people in the organization. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely the opposite, right? It's the more senior people, particularly in, I think the greatest risks that I see are in what I call proprietary owned or proprietary operated businesses, right? So it's those licensed professionals, like I've said, engineers and accountants and so on, or it's just the clever person who's built their factory, from scratch, right? And now they have this brilliant company employing 500 people or 1,000 people, and they're making money hand over fist, and they think that everything they've done right is successful, which means they're highly intelligent, they're super smart, everything they do is right. They're the ones that are the greatest risk, because they kind of have the worst of both worlds, right? One, they have the greatest access to that confidential, most damaging information, but two, they have this sort of hubris, right? This false sense of security that they're smarter than the bad guy, and they haven't worked out that the bad guy's a lot smarter and knows how to play on that kind of ego. Right. So I would actually say in awareness training, you're absolutely right. I put my focus on the executive layer, because you can, one, show them those kind of risks, but two, you can couple that with the fiduciary side of it, right? So what does your accountability look like as an officer of the company? That's why you need to be looking at these kind of things and actually incorporating even sort of mini or light incident response simulations into it, where it's like, let's just walk through one, so that they start to understand that when you deal with a cybersecurity issue, that cybersecurity is not an IT problem to solve, that it's a business risk to manage, and that there may be decisions through that course where they're like, no, I don't want you, disabling all remote access, because I know when that occurs, that's going to cause a client problem. That's going to become public. And, and so, no, you're not turning that off. And meanwhile, the IT team's like, man, we have to do this because they're all over us. It becomes a business decision, right? Again, it's risk, right? But that helps them understand that, like I said, cybersecurity isn't a buy another box or just train people better or fire the person who clicked on something, because those things, never solved the problem. They weren't the root cause in the first place. And it generally means you're just sort of damned to repeat the same mistake or, be victimized by it again because you never really did solve the problem.
Right. Yeah. And I think the one thing that kind of was a shining light for me was we did a scan with ID Agent on an organization for the dark web.
Yeah.
Executive.
Yeah.
And then you're like, John Doe, executive. And you're like, oh my God. Like,
yes.
And you see the sense of their company email addresses out in the public, right? And like sites like the Eventbrite or something like that. It's like, use a Gmail account. Like, don't use your work address, right?
Yeah. Segregate the two. And even their families. That's the other one I've seen, is that their families are targeted. One firm lost over 400,000 in business email compromise because they were able to spoof the spouse, right? And they started sending bills for some of the. She was buying artwork for their new office, and they were able to spoof those invoices, and they paid out, as they said, over $400,000 until they actually worked out that they weren't paying the legitimate art dealer. And they had only gone after her. They had never touched her boss. So they never actually got inside the firewall, right? So you really do have to think about what the risk is by extension, right? What your kids talk about or what your spouse might brag about on, things like Facebook.
Oh, exactly. And I think that's where we're talking about. The concern is that as you're looking at that, who can be compromised, socially engineered, all that in your, close, network and vicinity, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's part of the whole, risk profiling, right? So again, just, okay, don't share, but if you have to share, like, you really have to think about what the consequences might be, and is it worth it, right? For that 30 seconds of feeling good in the brag, it might not be, because it can be extremely costly down the road.
Exactly. So Mark, just quick, how can people get a hold of you? What's the best way to reach out?
Yeah, absolutely. You can visit eCentire.com, or you can visit MB Sangster. And I'd love to hear from you, and any thoughts you have or any information you'd like, I'd be sure to be really happy to provide that for you.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Mark.
You're welcome.
So, hey, Chris, how's it going? You ready?
Yep, ready to go. Thanks.
Awesome. I'll just bring you up on the screen now. And then you're good to go.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for the couple plugs there. Tough act to follow. Good evening, everybody. My name is Chris Golden. Just a real quick bio. I know he read it to me. Air Force Colonel, retired, so I've done this against real bad guys in real war. Done some cybersecurity stuff for Wall Street and now healthcare. And then on my part-time job for about a year and a half, almost 2 years, was trying to stand up the CMMC AB for the Department of Defense. So we'll talk about CMMC here. As I'm presenting, I can't see the questions. So Brandon, if you would sort of call out any questions that come in, and I'll stop and try to answer them as we go along. All right, here's what we're talking about tonight. Give you a little intro to what the program is, talk about all the different parts and pieces, and then maybe some steps to how to prepare for it if you're thinking maybe you might have to do this one of these days, and hopefully I'll leave some time for Q&A. And just like Mark, I'll have some contact information at the end. So if you have any questions, tomorrow morning while you're making breakfast, or an epiphany while you're in the shower, by all means, reach out to me and I'll try to answer them. Okay, so why CMMC? Why the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification? The Department of Defense in the United States estimates that there's roughly over 600 billion, and that's with a B, in intellectual property each year. And if you look at the two pictures there, one is the U.S. Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps F-35 Lightning II aircraft, and one is the Chinese FC-31. And if you look very closely, those are almost the same aircraft. I wonder how that happened, right? Currently, there's a requirement in a number of defense contracts that sort of exchange sensitive information called NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology down here in the States, 800 TAC 171. It's self-attestation. So companies get to say, yep, we are compliant with the requirement without really much else happening. Many contractors do not follow, but they say they do, right? So they raise their hand and tell the government, yep, we're compliant, but in reality, they are nowhere near it. There's same thing with lower level DFARS, Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations is what DFARS stands for, base contracts. So there's only about 17 controls in some of the lower models of compliance. But again, there's still a cybersecurity requirement there. But again, no oversight into those programs on sort of whether they're being followed or not. And the DoD said, okay, we're still losing a lot of intellectual property. Let's get something with teeth. And so that's where CMMC sort of came from. Okay, it's going to require all U.S. defense contractors. So if you are a Canadian company and you are not doing business with the U.S. Department of Defense, you probably have no CMMC requirement. However, if you think that's a good way to go and you know, want to use it anyway, it's certainly your decision, your business call. But this is right now only applicable to to companies that have contracts with the U.S. Department of Defense. So if you got to complete a CMMC audit of your cybersecurity posture once every 3 years, so you've got a sort of a 3-year window there between assessments that you've got to sort of stay good. The audit, instead of being self-attestation under 171, it will be an independent third party. So there's no more self-attestation. When I was on the CMMC AB, I actually trained the 100 or so provisional assessors that are out in the ecosystem now, ready to start the first assessments as soon as the US DoD releases the first few contracts that they call the pilots that will have a CMMC requirement. There's only going to be about a dozen contracts or so here over the next few months that have that, but it's going to be an independent third-party investigation or assessment, not self-attestation. The audit is pass-fail with a small grace period to address gaps. It's going to be 90 days. So if you've got some little things you didn't quite do during the on-site assessment, you can fix them within 90 days. But if you note there, you got to bring the same evaluator back to do the reevaluation. It says no POAMs there. If you're not familiar with POAM, is a plan, objectives and milestones, or a project of objectives and milestones. It's your roadmap for getting things fixed. So maybe you don't encrypt data. Let's say you would have a POAM that says, here's how we're going about buying some encryption software and installing it and using it, et cetera, et cetera. Under NIST 171, companies are allowed to use POAMs to basically write away capabilities they don't have, and the government's okay with that. Well, now under CMMC, that's going to result in a fail, and so no real POAMs are going to be allowed in the CMMC model. And you must receive the correct CMMC level prior to contract award. It's based on the type of data you got, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Once the vast majority of contractors supporting the DoD have a CMMC certification, we think that'll move back to time of bid. So you won't even be allowed to bid on a contract unless you are currently CMMC certified. But since nobody is right now, they're going to have that at contract award. So you can bid, win the contract, and then have a little window of opportunity to go through your CMMC assessment before contract award. Okay, the model, based on several existing cyber frameworks, they combine stuff from NIST, ISO. You all should be familiar with some of the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations, as well as some best practices from the UK, Australia, and even Canada and the European Union. Combine best practices from around the globe. It really does a good job, I think, of combining a cyber practice model. So think of a SOC 2 Type 2 or an ISO 27000 series, or maybe even 9000 series, with a maturity model. So think CMMI, if you're familiar with that. 5 layers for both, 5 levels, sorry, for both the cyber practices and the maturity processes. And you must meet both the practices or the controls and the processes or the maturity for each CMMC level. And the model is cumulative, so everything below that is also in scope for you. So for instance, if you're trying to achieve CMMC level 3, but you only achieve level 3 on the controls, but you're level 2 on the practices, that would be a fail for level 3, because you also have to do everything at level 2 and at level 1 to achieve level 3. So it's quite a cumulative kind of model. Model covers 17 domains across cybersecurity. If you're relatively familiar with cybersecurity, they are not going to look surprising. Access control we'll talk about, but there's all kinds of other ones, from how you do patching and backups to your counter-phishing campaign and your awareness and training, a lot of things that Mark talked about. 5 different security posture levels, and then 5 different maturity levels. Okay, looking at the bottom there, level 1, it's defined as basic cyber hygiene. There's only 17 controls in CMMC level 1, and you can see the maturity processes really don't exist because it's just performed. So there's really nothing you need to do other than just control those 17 controls. And you notice there in the middle, it says FCI, that stands for Federal Contract Information. FCI is basically that data that are in federal contracts that is not intended for public consumption. So think possibly cost, think about possibly schedules, some directed integrations or things like that, that is really not designed to be out there in the public, is what FCI is. And so you can only handle FCI at level 1 and level 2 of the model. When you get up to level 3, 4, and 5, you see it turns into something called CUI, or controlled but unclassified information, which is just, again, a little bit more sensitive data. Maybe the paint on the airplane that's going to be radar absorbing is important, and they've got some specifications in there that's, again, not classified, but it is controlled. So they want to provide a little bit more control and security around that kind of data. But you should not have CUI if you are a level 1 or level 2 organization. The first time you should start dealing with that is at CMMC level 3. Moving up the model to level 2, we've gone from basic to intermediate cyber hygiene, and it's now documented. We're interpreting documented basically means policies. So all the controls you have some policies that talk about how you're going to implement those controls. It's certainly not one for one, right? You can have an acceptable use policy or an information security policy or anything else that's got multiple, controls within that document. It should not be a one-for-one mapping. That's sort of a ridiculous way to do it, but it would satisfy the requirements. So you'll see a bunch of different ways probably. Level 3, we've now moved up to good cyber hygiene and managed. So managed is really about a plan. So it talks about the type of people who you'll be hiring, the certifications and education they need, the tools they need, the resourcing in terms of budget they need to do their job, all those kind of things, of how we're going to plan to execute these cyber practices. Level 4 and 5 are still sort of up in the air. We have an idea what they are, but the Department of Defense has not really released a lot of data on them. But you can see it moves from proactive at level 4 to advanced progressive at level 5. To give you an idea, advanced progressive includes a 24/7 security operations center. So they're really designed probably for some of the bigger organizations, maybe the prime contractors like the Lockheed Martins or the Raytheons or the General Dynamics or stuff like that. It'd be very difficult for an organization that's small, medium, or micro to achieve level 5, but we think far less than 1% of the defense industrial base will ever be at level 4 and 5. And then over on the process side, it's reviewed, which is really metrics, and then optimizing using those metrics to make your program better. Here are the 17 domains. I'm not going to read them all to you, but again, if you're pretty familiar, or at least personally familiar with cybersecurity, they should not really be surprising. Recovery, physical protection, personal security, risk management. Yeah, it's all pretty standard cybersecurity stuff. And just for whatever reason, these were the domain clumps that the DoD decided to put them in. And I'm okay with it. I've gone back and forth with a number of people about putting things in different buckets, but at the end of the day, I think they did a pretty good job of figuring out what the domain should be and separating things so it sort of makes sense from an assessment point of view and from an execution point of view as a company. Okay, let's dive into level 1 just a little bit more. We think the vast majority of companies will be level 1 only. So the number we had when I was on the board as our planning factor was about 350,000 companies in the defense supply chain. And we thought well over 300,000 of them would only be level 1. They would never be level 2, 3, 4, or 5. Introduces basic cyber hygiene for those who have little to none, right? So a small 3 or 4 person shop, maybe cloud-based, that really has never thought about cybersecurity. This is really for them. Of the 17 domains, it only covers 6 of them. Of the 171 total controls in the model, it only covers 17 controls. Again, there are no maturity processes. It's called perform, so you just have to do it. It's sort of the Nike swoosh there. And it's designed to protect that FCI stuff, that federal contract information. There are the 6 domains: access control, identification and authentication, media protection, physical protection, system and communication protection, and system and information integrity. So all the other domains are covered in higher levels of the model. And again, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but there it is at level 1. So you're only dealing with FCI and it's performed. There's really no other maturity process there. Okay, moving on to level 2. Moving up the chain there are the picture. So we've gone from basic to intermediate, and now we're up to documented, which again, we think is called, basically policies. That you have policies of thing, and we're still in the FCI world. We have not crossed the Rubicon into the CUI world. Level 2 was really designed as a bridging solution. We don't expect the DoD will ever issue a contract requiring CMMC level 2. Really, it was designed for those companies that, for whatever reason, need to move from level 1 to level 3. So either they're going to start receiving CUI and therefore need to be at level 3, or for whatever business competitive reason, they think they need to, advertise and market that themselves that they're level 3. But it's really a bridging solution to help get from 1 to 3, because it's a pretty big jump from 17 controls at level 1 to 130 controls at level 3, and from really no maturity processes at all at level 1 to a managed or planned level at level 3. So it's got most of the controls at level 3, but not all. Still, the processes are documented. Again, it's the policies, and you're still not allowed to handle CUI. You'll see it in the model referred to, but it's really notional. It's like, if they had CUI, what would they do in the situation? But they're not allowed to handle this at level 2. But it's really a bridging solution for those companies who are on a journey from 1 to 3. Again, moved up to intermediate hygiene. It covers 15 of the 17 domains, and of the 171 controls total, 130 controls at level 3, 72 controls are in level 2. So again, we've gone from 17 to 72, so it's a pretty big jump. And we've gone from basically no maturity processes to at least having a policy on how we're going to do all this kind of stuff. So it's a journey to level 3. And you can see the cumulative aspect, right? It includes the 17 practices at level 1 plus the 55 new practices at level 2 for a total of 72 practices because the model is cumulative. And there's everything but asset management and but situational awareness. Everything else is included. So it covers 15 of the 17 domains at level of the model. Sorry. Okay, moving on to level 3. Right, we moved from intermediate at 2 to good cyber hygiene. 16 domains are in play from the model, 130 total controls, and the maturity process is now moved up to what we call managed, or again, having a plan for executing how we're going to do all the cyber practices. So now we are into the CUI world at level 3. That's the first time you can handle controlled but unclassified information is being CMMC level 3. But you can also obviously handle FCI because you are cumulatively doing 2 and 1 to achieve 3. There's the cumulative nature again, 17 controls at 1, plus the 55 we added at 2, plus the 58 we added at 3, brings us to a total of 130 practices for levels 1, 2, and 3 because it is cumulative. For those of you that are familiar at all with the NIST 800 Special Publication 800 Tech 171 model, it's got 110 controls, and so it's the same 110 controls are in level 3, and then we've added 20 new controls that we call Delta controls because they are new to round out some things that we thought were best practices. So it is almost NIST 171. So if you happen to be NIST 171 compliant, you're really, really close to being ready to achieve level 3 on CMMC. There's the 16 domains of level 3. Notice personnel security is not specifically covered in level 3, but it is covered in level 1 and level 2. So by definition of a cumulative model, you're going to have to do those kind of things. But you're also going to have to do them at the level 3 maturity model level. So you got to do it at the managed level, even though they are level 1 and level 2 processes or practices. Sorry, can get confusing. Okay, 4 and 5, a lot of guesswork here. Again, we've got the model, we can see it, but the DoD really hasn't released a whole lot of information. You can see 4 there is what we call proactive. So we've gone from good to proactive, and we've gone from managed to reviewed. So that's really about metrics, being able to keep good metrics on sort of how your processes are working. But again, we're sort of waiting for the DoD to release a bunch more information on this kind of stuff. And then level 5, you're up to advanced progressive, and now you're optimizing. So you're using those metrics to make your processes better over time. More to follow. Okay, so an actual CMMC assessment, a defense contractor, or when I was on the board, we had to make up our own acronyms, right? Because that's what you do when you're working with the Department of Defense. So we called them Organizations Seeking Certification, or OSCs. We'll contract with a CMMC third-party assessment organization, or a C3PAO. For those of you that have heard of FedRAMP, they also use C3PAOs there, so I think that's probably where they stole that. The C3PAO will have either as a W-2 employee or a 1099 employee certified and trained assessors or auditors that will actually do the assessments. When I was on the board, I created the training and trained the first 100 provisional assessors that are out in the ecosystem now that will do the first few assessments once they start, whenever the DoD releases those initial pilot contracts. That contract will be very, very similar to any other kind of external assessment contract you sign, whether it be for a SOC 2 Type 2, whether it be for ISO, whether it be for high trust, pick your poison there. It'll talk about the scope, the timing, what artifacts need to be exchanged, the personnel involved, interviews, costs, all those kind of things. It's really not going to be that much different than anything else you would do when you bring in an external a look at your systems and sort of how it's going on. Okay, the coordinators, the assessors will coordinate and plan prior to the on-site visit, just like you would do now with an ISO or a SOC 2 Type 2. During the on-site, you can expect probably a kickoff meeting, get everybody in the same room and sort of meet each other and explain expectations, all that kind of stuff. Probably a daily wrap-up meeting. One of the things I harped on when I trained the provisional assessors was there should be no surprises. So that daily wrap-up meeting, if something is not going well, you should hear about it. during that daily wrap-up meeting or before, but there should absolutely be no surprises for anybody. This is not an adversarial thing. We're trying to bring everybody up, sort of a rising tide raises all boats kind of thing. We want everybody to get better. Have a final out brief and let's sort of know how you did. Handle issues in near real time or in real time or to near real time. If eligible, hopefully you'll get your score before the assessors depart. They'll congratulate you and say, congratulations, you passed, or they'll tell you, hey, you're really close. You got 90 days to fix these couple things, or they'll tell you, hey, you really did terrible. I want you to take another swing at it. We'll come back in 6 months or a year. And if required, a list of actions need to meet the standard and next steps. Again, you've got 90 days to sort of do those things. Think about like maybe not having a policy. Maybe you didn't have a policy on access control. 90 days is more than enough time to sort of write that policy and get it signed and approved and sort of out into the ecosystem, however you do your corporate policies. And so that's what we thought. If you needed, let's say, a DLP or a data loss prevention system, and you had to have one but you didn't, you're not going to get that installed in 90 days and tuned correctly and all the other things. So it's really for smaller little things that should be easy to fix. It should not be for major muscle movements here in that 90-day window. Okay, CMMC preparation. These are my recommendations after creating third-party risk programs and doing on-site assessments, et cetera, throughout my career. These are just things I think are important. This is not guidance from the DoD or the accreditation body. This is just some things I thought might help people in their journey to getting prepared for their CMMC assessment. So all errors are mine, and I've gotten good at catching spears over the past few years, so feel free. Okay, so current activities. What are you required to comply with right now? If you have a U.S. defense contract, you probably either have a lower level DFARS, again, Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation clause, that's equivalent to CMMC level 1, or you have the NIST 800 TAC 171 clause. You need to be doing that, right? You can't just sort of pencil whip it and say, yep, we're good to the government, and then have this huge lift to get to whatever your CMMC score. Maybe if you're an international company, maybe you have an ISO requirement. Again, very, very helpful in getting towards CMMC. So whatever you're required to do now, do that. I think that's the easiest way to get going in the right direction. Again, the DFARS are basically equivalent to CMMC level 1, and the NIST 171 standard is basically equivalent to CMMC level 3 with some additional 20 controls and some maturity stuff. And begin taking your company's cybersecurity posture seriously, right? Most people, when they start a company, are not experts in local, state, or federal labor law, right? So what do? They hire an HR professional, human resources. They set up a little human resources shop, and that job of that shop and those people is to keep the company out of trouble because the owners of the company want to focus on their business. Same thing with account payable and accounts receivable. They're not experts on accounting or Sarbanes-Oxley, which is SOX there if you didn't know that. It's an American financial reporting thing for publicly traded companies down here in the States. But they hire people that know that stuff. So you got to do the same thing with cybersecurity. Don't expect you to be an expert. Go do your business, whatever that is, making widgets for whomever or providing whatever service. But you need to hire the right people to help you do this kind of stuff and keep you out of trouble. So take that stuff seriously. Next thing I think you need to do, you need to identify the sensitive data on your network, right? So CMMC is designed to prevent the theft of leakage or of FCI, federal contract information, or CUI controlled but unclassified information. So do you have that on your system? Do you have any other sensitive data or proprietary data on your system that you want to protect? Where is that data? How does it come in? Where does it flow around to? What systems can touch it? Try to figure all those kind of things out, because as we move forward, identifying that sensitive data and limiting it to different systems and preventing it from going to other systems, frankly, it does not need to be on, is going to make your life a lot easier in the long run. So it's going to limit the cost and the effort you have to do later on. So scoping, something you should talk about with your CMMC auditor. They're going to help you try to figure out what the scope is. But we want to protect data, but protecting data does incur cost and it does require effort, right? And so the example I use with boards all the time, obviously, we don't want to protect $100 worth of data with a $10,000 tool. That makes no sense. We want to do that the other way around, right? We want to protect $10,000 worth of data with a $100 tool. But you want to place the effort and pay the cost to protect the data that is required to be protected. For those of you that don't know, PCI DSS is the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. It's basically the security standard used by credit card companies to protect your credit card information. And so most of you probably have a credit card. It's probably got a chip and PIN. That's been a movement that's in the PCI DSS world. And so they only have systems that process the credit cards, are the only ones in scope for their PCI DSS audit. So when their auditors come in to look at the processing of credit cards, it's a couple servers, it's a couple endpoints, and there's really nothing else to look at, because they limit the flow of that information, right? Limit the number of servers or endpoints that are required to protect. It's going to limit your cost, right? Is there a cost difference between an assessment of 5 systems and protecting 5 systems versus 1,000 systems? You betcha. Of course there is. So that's what you're trying to leverage, is limiting that scope to as few systems as possible. So that's where your effort has to be put. That's where your money has to be put, and you're going to limit all those kind of things. Shared infrastructure. We think some companies may do this. Again, it's not a best practice or anything yet, but there are companies that are going to be assessed that are a little bit larger, like the Primes, the Lockheed Martins, the Raytheons, the General Dynamics. Maybe they just loan their equipment or infrastructure to their subcontractors, right? So if I've already gone through a CMMC level 3 assessment, I passed it. I know this laptop is on my infrastructure. It's got all the correct controls on it to be CMMC level 3. I just give that, loan it to the sub, and then we exchange sensitive data basically on my network, even though they've got access to it. VDI, if you're familiar with that, virtual desktop infrastructure, is another way to do that. If you disable things like copy and paste so they can't move data around, then the data really never exists on their endpoint. So that's a good way to do it. So with proper controls in place, right, the subs will not have the sensitive data on their system. So that's going to help them out a lot. It'll limit that scope for their assessment, and then limit their cost and effort to achieve a specific CMMC certification, because they're maybe have no infrastructure that requires a certification, which would be a good thing for them.
Hey, Chris.
Yeah.
So I got a question for you. Do you think PCI is secure?
It is not. Well, okay. So there is no such thing as perfect cybersecurity, and there is no such thing as zero risk. So let's start there. So is it secure? Well, it depends on what you mean by secure. I think, the intelligence I've seen is the vast majority of criminals that were harvesting credit card numbers to go, monetize, have now moved over to healthcare, which is why I now work in healthcare, because of the chip and pin kind of technology has really dominated that space, right? It's basically multi-factor authentication. If you think about it, it's something you have, your card with the pin in it, and then something the pin number. And so, it depends on your definition of secure, but I have no problem going out and using my credit card online. I take it out and I go to dinner with it. The waiter or waitress can steal the card number if they wanted to, but that kind of stuff is really sort of going the way of the dodo. So I'm perfectly comfortable with it, but I think it depends on sort of what your definition of secure is.
Okay, yeah, because I think the our RS Poor is asking about ISO 27001. Is it better than PCI? No. And then he's asking about 307. Isn't it blockchain?
Well, okay. So, ISO 27000 series is a bunch of cyber controls for general cyber use, where PCI DSS is specifically for credit card providers and credit card processors of data. And then we get into blockchain. So blockchain is a completely different animal. I actually hold a certified blockchain security professional certification, whatever that means. But when I was on Wall Street, we were looking at disruptors, and obviously blockchain was a major disruptor to the financial industry here in the United States. So that was something I got paid to take a hard look at. And so, I would never recommend putting any sensitive information on a blockchain. I would have an API call out to a secure database on the blockchain, but I would never put it on the blockchain, because A, it is immutable, right? So you can't ever take it off the blockchain. And B, once we get things like quantum coming around, we're going to start breaking encryption schemes like nobody's business. And so if you've got a good encryption scheme now on the blockchain, it will be broken by quantum. And now you've got sensitive data that is unencrypted basically on the blockchain that you cannot remove. And so a couple different things there. Happy to, please reach out to me at the end when I give you my point of contact details, or reach out to me on LinkedIn, and we'll have a more nuanced conversation. But really 3 different things, I think, in my mind there, between sort of the ISO 27000 and 9000 series, the PCI DSS and blockchain stuff. So probably did not answer that really well, sorry, but not really have time to sort of go into the nuances of all that kind of stuff. So please reach out to me and we'll have a better conversation. Yeah,
and I think just to recap, just for RS Poor, contact Chris, ISO 27001, depending on your use, PCI, DSS. A lot of times it's more for e-commerce financial institutions kind of doing that. And then, like you said, the 307 is blockchain, just on a high elevator. It's just so people can kind of understand it. And then, like, if you have more questions, please reach out to Chris. He's a wealth of information.
I hope so. I got to now hold up that end of the bargain, so that's my bad.
Well, there you go, Chris. I put you on the spot now.
There you go. Yeah, yeah. So again, if you want a more nuanced conversation on any of those things, or just talk philosophy, by all means, reach out to me and we can have that conversation. Okay, so reciprocity. There are a lot of standards out there. In fact, we just talked about 3 of them, right? We talked about ISOs, we talked about PCI DSS, and we talked about blockchain stuff. What is the government going to do? The government has said, the Department of Defense has said that they want to give people credit for things they've already done and paid for, right? Most obviously, one is probably going to be FedRAMP. That's basically, if you are a cloud provider providing cloud services to the U.S. government, you have to be FedRAMP certified, and there's an assessment team that will come out and do an assessment, frankly, very similar to CMMC, not quite as draconian as CMMC, but you should get credit for that. So if I'm using a FedRAMP provider as part of my sort of ecosystem, I should get credit for whatever they have been through, is basically what reciprocity is at. Completely unknown, the government's still thinking about it, but we expect them to approve some reciprocity for already certified systems and services. And again, because FedRAMP is a government standard, you'll see that. But over time, I would not be surprised at all that ISO or PCI DSS or some kind of blockchain one would get added to the list there, so that you've gone through a formal assessment. Again, SOC 2 Type 2, I'm in healthcare now, so high trust. Pick your poison, but you should get credit for that. Maybe not 100%, right? But at least you should get some. Access control is one of the domains in level 1. There are 4 practices in access domain at level 1. So maybe your cloud provider provides 2 of them. Okay. Well, now you only have to provide the other 2, would be an example of what the reciprocity would be. And so your assessor would not look at those 2 that are provided to you already by somebody else. You've inherited them. And so you just got to worry about the 2 that you are responsible for. And so, again, there's a lot of work to be done here, but we expect these kind of things to come over time as the program matures and grows. Okay, happy to continue to answer questions. Again, there's my number, my email, the website. You can get a hold of me anyway, LinkedIn as well. Happy to continue the conversation now or in the future, however y'all want to do this. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kristen. Just give me a second here. I'm actually going to bring James and myself in here, and bring in Mark as well. So thank you so much. That was a lot of great information. I think, again, covering this broad topic of CMMC right now, where everyone's trying to figure it out. I mean, from my understanding, it's kind of like the wild west, right? There's this big, mandate coming out that everyone's supposed to do, but what are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to do it? Who do we talk to? Are they the right person to talk to, right? So having you come out and providing that information and giving some more guidance, I think is really required right now, because so many people are trying to understand the CMMC.
Yeah, happy to do it. There's been a, having been on the inside for so long, it's sort of old hat to me, and I can't, sometimes put myself in the feet of somebody and have the empathy for those kind of things. So I try to answer as many questions as possible, but frankly, it's a moving target at times. And so I think that's, these kind of things, when James invited me to do the first one, there were a dearth of questions, and I think there'll be another, a whole bunch here as well, but that's what we got to do, is sort of get the word out and try to continue to answer questions and calm people down.
Well, I got some questions already coming in here, and I'll just bring Joanne. Joanne was asking, working with a small company struggling with the cost of meeting the CMMC ML3 requirements, have you heard costs will be recouped through applications of indirect GA rates?
Yeah, so the Department of Defense has said on multiple occasions publicly that preparation for the CMMC assessment, the continuing adherence to the CMMC standard over time in the 3 years between the assessments will be an allowable cost. And I'll put that in air quotes, right? I don't know what that means. Very few people, frankly, know what that means. There are different contract vehicles where allowable costs are easy to put in, and there are other contract vehicles, fixed firm price, that it's not so easy to put in. So it's a great question, and I don't want to lie to you, but I really don't know. That's a question for the Department of Defense. But they have said all along that it will be an allowable cost, and they've got to work through the mechanisms to try to figure out how you're going to do that from a programmatic point of view to actually sort of charge it to the contract.
Awesome. And then Joanne, she's really trying to get as much information as possible here, which is great. I mean, keep the questions coming. Are there any resources that you would help me better understand if there are guidelines on how much dollars, of course, money, are available, or what's the GA rates are? So again, I think she's trying to really understand the budget for this. Yeah,
I wish I had a good answer for you. Unfortunately, I don't. That's a DoD issue. By all means, go to the Department of Defense Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment. They're the ones running the show. They've got a website on the the Pentagon website or whatever. And by all means, ask them. They should have a contact us kind of button and ask that question. But yeah, I don't. Those kind of specifics are something the DoD is going to have to put out fairly soon to get this thing rolling, and we haven't heard anything about it yet.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Chris.
So I'm sure Joanne's not thinking about it.
So yeah, keep the questions coming. So now, do you guys have any questions for each other? I know I was seeing Mark in the back end asking, he's ready for the CMMC discussion from Chris because he had some information he was looking for too. Did you guys have any questions amongst each other?
Yeah, Chris, I was just going to ask you if you've seen that sort of downdrafting of CMMC, even if it's aspirational, to other non-DoD contractors, right? Like I said, I've had inquiries from municipalities, utilities, and so on.
Yeah, so we've certainly had, when I was on the board, we had conversations with the Department of Homeland Security, NASA, and the Government Services Administration, GSA. DHS and GSA have already put sort of contingency clauses in some of their newer contracts that say, hey, by the way, as you get this contract, we may change this cybersecurity requirement, basically NIST 171, to this cybersecurity requirement, basically CMMC. But we haven't seen any formal ones come out to actually say you have to do CMMC. We've also had conversations with multiple countries, Japan, Australia, Norway, United Kingdom, Germany, who are, obviously they're interested because they have a lot of supply chain people that are in their countries, but they're supporting the U.S. Department of Defense. Canada would be another one, obviously. So I would say if you're in that world, keep your eye on it. If you're not, sort of on contract or going to be on contract with the U.S. Department of Defense, CMMC may not come to you for a number of years, if it comes at all. And so, if someone comes knocking on your door and says, hey, you have to be CMMC certified by tomorrow and pay me a lot of money, unless you've got a defense contract that says that, there's probably really no reason to do that.
Right. That was the other question I was going to ask you, was whether or not there was some sort of guilt by association that if, you're CMMC certified here, that if you work with a contractor in the UK, Canada, Australia, and so on, if that would cover you.
Yeah, again, I think that's a great question for the Department of Defense on how they're going to sort of accept that. But I think basically, if you have a contract with the U.S. DoD, you're going to have to eventually, by 2025, 2026, have a CMMC certification on the books. And then your subs, it will depend on what information is flowed to them. So again, if you flow just general, sort of commercial off-the-shelf COTS kind of data, there's probably no cyber requirement at all. If you flow some FCI, then they probably have to be level 1. If you flow some CUI to them, then they're probably going to be level 3.
So what about contract chains that potentially flow cross-border? I assume that's not allowed.
Well, it's certainly going to have to be allowed at some point. I know I was just reading the other day, the UK Ministry of Defense basically said, hey, all UK defense contractors, stop worrying about CMMC, do what we're telling you to do. And then we as the government will talk with the U.S. government and try to figure out what the middle ground is over time. But, again, right now, the DoD has said if you're a UK defense contractor with a U.S. DoD contract, then you're going to have a CMMC certification. But those countries are going to, they're going to get in a room and fight it out and figure it out, and then we'll be told what to do.
Awesome. Any other questions, Mark?
Nope, that's good. Thanks so much, Chris. That was really informative.
Yep, anytime. And I loved your presentation. Good stuff from you.
So now, question for you guys. I mean, you guys are deep into the cybersecurity world and like defense in depth and no trust, all these things. What would you recommend the people that are watching this right now over the next 6 months, in their 6-month plan? What should they be looking at right now? Where should their focus be? I'll start with Mark first, and then we'll go to Chris, and then we'll bring in James last.
Really for me, it's create that cycle, right? Do the risk assessment, understand where where you are, where do you have vulnerabilities, plug those vulnerabilities. It's kind of micro CMMC to some degree, right? It's effectively putting a plan in place, measuring that plan, and when you find areas that you need to improve, then that's where you should be focusing. And the big piece of that, honestly, is starting with the executive, getting them involved. So that they understand the risks, so that they understand their obligations, and you don't look like you're just coming asking, with your hat in hand, constantly asking for more money. Because FUD scare tactics only go so far, and like Chris talked about, right? I mean, we're not going to pay $10,000 to protect a system that's worth 100, right? That's not it. So you do have to have a reasonable model where you identify a threat, what the likelihood of that threat occurring, what's the cost, what would that look like if we don't do anything, what's the cost look like if we do something, and finding the right balance.
Now, with that, the plan you're talking about, is it a business plan versus a technology plan? A lot of cybersecurity guys kind of go, we have the top right Gartner best solution, kind of But now when we're looking at cybersecurity, should it be more of a business risk assessment, business kind of analysis on that solution versus just technology driven?
Yeah, absolutely, right? Because there's, how many companies, what's the investment numbers that we see? Billions every year, tens of billions, hundreds of billions spent on cybersecurity technology, and yet you've got breach after breach after breach, right? So compliance doesn't mean owned, or compliance doesn't guarantee you're not going to be owned, right? And that's where these technologies, a lot of the problem is they are brilliant pieces of technology, they're brilliant tools, but they have to be tuned, configured, constantly updated. They have to be monitored and managed, and you have to know what to do with them, right? That's a lot of what I see is you get companies that go and they buy a technology, they buy like an AI engine or some threat feed, and they get this beautiful dashboard and they look at it and you go, that's awesome. I can show that in the board meetings, but they don't know what to do with it, right? So they can't turn that information that they're receiving into actions that they can use to protect their business. And so that's that's part of the problem that I see is this little bit of a false sense of security because I have a big security budget. I've invested in these tools. But the reality is if you don't know what you're doing with them, it doesn't matter, right? They're still going to get exploited. Bad guys are really, really smart at doing this stuff. They buy them and they sandbox them or reverse engineer them, just like we do too, right? So you need a comprehensive program that ties all those things together. Otherwise, criminals do a good job of kind of playing in the shadows in between them.
Right, and that's what I was wondering, because you see a lot of the technicians and the really technical, smart people driving technology, right? SOAR, endpoint, you name it. But when it comes to making the decision on the organization, it seems like it's better having it more of a business decision versus a technology driven.
Oh, 100%. Dollars and cents, not ones and zeros, right? So you do have to talk about like I said, what's the threat? What's the likelihood of it occurring? What are the consequences of that event if they did happen? Because I've seen that, and I do this all the time. That's why I talked about incident response simulations early on. If you do these kind of lunchtime kind of workshops, right? They're effective because you have the IT person say, well, they're on our domain controllers. You're like, okay, so what does the CFO know? They don't know what that means, right? But if I start to talk about, well, they've installed a script on an Exchange server, and here's what they're doing, right? They're harvesting this information, or they have the ability to harvest this information. That to them, then they suddenly go, you mean they have access to those particular assets, like the ones that Chris was talking about, right? Like understand what you have, where they're stored, where they move, and so on. That's where you start to get that the light bulb goes on, right? And dealing with, as I said, the non-technical consequences and the non-technical decisions that have to be made. Like, do you inform the client? Well, first place to check is a contract. The second place would definitely be regulatory state level obligations. But in a lot of cases, there's an awful lot of gray in there, right? There's sort of, there's soft language. Or it's just simply unclear. There is no formal opinion yet that's been decided. So now you have to make that judgment call. And I do that in one scenario. I do this is real life example where they have an event where client A is affected and they've landed client B, who's like the biggest, the biggest client in their history. Do you tell them? Right. And you're going to get lots of debate. I'm not telling them what the right answer is here. What I'm doing is making them think about it, putting them, put themselves in that situation to say it's a bit of a no-win, right? Do I want to tell them and lose the new business? Do I want to tell them and hope that they're really friendly and they go, okay, well, thanks for, being upfront and transparent? I don't know. The point is that's a business decision. That wasn't a technical one. The classic, of course, was DLA Piper, which was a law firm hit by NotPetya a couple of years ago. And they posted, one of their IT people put up a whiteboard in the lobby that said, don't connect. And the problem was that got on social media super fast and ended up on 6 o'clock news. Again, that person, I'm not saying they did the wrong thing, but there are other consequences that are well beyond, should we buy endpoint? How do we configure that? When do we invest in a SOAR? And frankly, if you don't know what to do with the tech, don't waste your money.
Right. Perfect. Thank you so much, Mark. Now, Chris, got one more question for you before we jump into that main question. George is asking, working with the private industry and other nations and critical to the success of the many U.S. Initiatives. Do you believe an overly cumbersome CMMC process should not be impeded those initiatives?
Yeah, I guess I would quibble with overly, cumbersome. Not sure what that really means. Again, for companies that are doing what they're supposed to be doing, it's a relatively light lift to get to CMMC, and that is certainly the DoD's position, and it does make a lot of sense. If they've been sort of pencil whipping the requirement, then it is going to be a lot more work. But yeah, I don't really know how that would impact cross-border kind of stuff to say, hey, here's a requirement. Again, I think there's going to be reciprocity decisions at some point. So the DoD may say, hey, if you're a Canadian company and you do whatever the Canadian version of this is, you're going to get 90% credit or 100% credit or something. They'll make those kind of decisions. So I don't think it's going to really stifle those initiatives. I think it might actually make them a little stronger as everybody's sort of competing along the same lines. Really, they've had to make the same kind of investments, and people aren't sort of cheating their way to the top. So I think that might make it a little bit better.
Awesome. Yeah. So to you, Chris, so what would you think in the next 6 months? Where should people, companies, organizations be focused?
Multi-factor authentication.
Okay. And why is that? Why MFA?
Yes.
Because there are more compromised username and password credentials on the dark web than there are people on the planet. And so, yeah, so if you are using a username and a password to log on to your systems, human nature is you are probably reusing that password in multiple systems. So it might be your Facebook, password, it's maybe your LinkedIn password, et cetera, et cetera. So, it's very easy to compromise those kind of things. So it is relatively cheap and easy for even very small shops to implement multi-factor authentication, whether it's a hard token, whether it's a soft token, whether it's a one-time password via text or anything else you can pick up. That's going to eliminate a lot of really sort of random noise in your system and let you sort of focus on doing some good things. That'll eliminate 95% of the crap you might see is just by doing that. So that is always my number one recommendation to anybody if they're asking where to start. That's MFA.
Now, what about with SIM jacking and things like that you can compromise to 2FA?
Well, you look at SolarWinds, right? So they get compromised at the build, right? So during the compile process, they get the malware out of there. The bad guys are smart and they want to win. They want to win just as much as we do, except they have to be lucky once. We have to be perfect all the time. And so you're never going to have, perfect security. You're never going to have zero risk. But if you want to eliminate a significant amount of risk, you start with things like MFA.
Okay, perfect. Now got, I think RS report he's asking here. You guys familiar with Wyoming legislation on decentralizing autonomous organizations? It was passed in Q1 this year. This is an American legendary thing. Are you guys familiar with that?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with it, no.
So we'll all have to Google that after this.
Yeah.
Decentralized autonomous organizations. Huh. Is it called Skynet?
It could be. It could be called Skynet. We'll have to look that up after. So James, what about yourself? Where do you think companies should be focused? People, organizations, even military, because I know you got some expertise in that area. Right? Where do you think they should be focused in the next 6 months?
I really think that they need to be aligning themselves to understanding the commercial sector and working together to reach common goals. Because I don't think one solution for the other is going to work, especially with the attacks that are currently going on in Canada and the United States right now.
Wow. Now, I know one thing that we've been talking about through these conversations is looking at, like, and Chris mentioned this, the encryption, right? The level of encryption as, you look at quantum computers coming out, and just it's a matter of time before what we have encrypted now starts to become, I almost call them a Swiss cheese, where, companies or hackers are starting to walk through it, time and time again. So something to look at is, what we talk about is, the next generation of encryption, right? Quantum proof, quantum resilient, all these different types of technologies are coming out now to keep your ear out and listen to that. The next thing that we're talking about, which I think is important, is looking at the business conversation. I don't think we have that enough at the technical level. Is the technical guys, in the field need to be able to understand the business side as well as the actual technical side, right? You're starting to get that more, but I think, we need to talk about that more and more. And especially like you look at pen testers and guys that are doing, great work, need to understand the business requirements, need to understand how business works so they can better educate the business on their solutions, their technologies. So that's kind of I'm seeing where the next 6 months where, we need to really focus on top of what all the great advice we got is also that, the understanding business, right? Because a lot of times we have these discussions about technologies and solutions and, like Mark said, the FUD stuff, right? Oh my God, there's a hacker in there, Russia. He's going to come get you, right? He's in the basement right there with a hood on. He's going to hack you. But so what? Like, how's that going to affect my business? What's going to happen? What's the impact? What's the risk? You know, what's the legal? What's the, you know, even with looking at our PR at risk, right? What is all that? And you go, I don't know, right? And then also now you have to have those discussions. So I think that's one thing, again, to add on to all the other MFA, you know, when Mark was talking about his solutions, you know, as well as James. On top of that is also understanding business, right? And just having those discussions.
Yeah, if you're not familiar, take a look at FAIR, Factor Analysis of Information Risk. That's a very good quantitative tool to move to those kind of discussions.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of books coming out now. Like you got the BSO, you got, you know, BISO, you have CISO books, things like that. You don't even have to take the course. Just grab the books as a resource, just to read them, just to get an idea how the senior level executives think, right? What are they looking at? What are they concerned about? And at least at that point, you can have those discussions, especially if you guys are on the technical level. I think it's just so important to have that knowledge.
Yeah, the National Association of Corporate Directors has a cyber risk handbook. It's like 50, 60 pages. It's an easy read, and they break it down into a kind of a 5-pillar program around what executive risk management looks like. But it goes both ways, right? Because it helps the people below them understand what drives them, where their obligations are, and how to communicate with them. And when you do, what are they looking for, right? Like what vocabulary do they use?
Right. Yeah. It's not like, oh my, this is the top quadrant, best solution, AI technology. They're like, executives are, okay, so what? How does that help the business? Right.
Yeah. I can't remember the name of the book, but I think it's like developing a cybersecurity program or something close to that. My father bought me a copy about 4 or 5 years ago, and I read about 2 pages, and it was sort of at the 8th grade level, and I threw it on the shelf and never really looked at it again for about 2 years. And then I'm talking to the board, and I'm getting the glazed, you know, eyes rolling back in their heads kind of thing. So then I went and bought 20 copies of that book, read it, and then gave it to every board member, just so we could have a more nuanced conversation, you know, start speaking the same language.
Now, what's that book?
I have to go pull it out.
If you have it, Chris, let me know.
Yeah, right? it was like, you know, developing your own cybersecurity program or something close to that.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, because I can look for it, then let everyone know, and then people can reach out.
Yeah.
Any last recommendations, guys?
Be inquisitive. Ask questions.
Yeah. Treat cybersecurity like a business risk, not like an IT budget to manage.
James, what about yourself?
Keep working together, be informative, read as much information as you get, and there'll be organizations like what we'll discuss at the end that will assist population, military, and governments alike in order to provide in real information that will be easy to break down and understand.
Awesome. And I think I kind of agree with Chris. Be curious. Understand this. I mean, this is something that I've learned in IT. Is you're a student of this. You're a student of IT. You're a student of cybersecurity. You never stop learning. What you think you know today, by tomorrow is going to be completely different. Yeah. Some compliance, program control, technical things going to come out, and it's going to flip what you know upside down, and then you're going to have to relearn something, right? So all of us are all students of cybersecurity, and that's what we're passionate about. And that's, you know, speaking on behalf of Chris and Mark, I mean, that's what I would assume, seeing the passion that you guys have in this. But I mean, we're all students. We're constantly learning. We're constantly having articles, books, stuff for reading just to keep consuming. So yeah, I think that's one thing I'd recommend, guys. Just be curious. Just keep reading. Always think that you're a student. You're always going to learn. New guys come in, you'll learn from. To senior level people, it's a 360 degree, right? You just keep learning.
Yep.
So, Mark, Chris, thank you so much. I'm going to put you guys in the lobby. Just hang out. We'll talk to you guys after. We're just going to finish off with James. So, James, what'd you think about tonight?
Fantastic show. Great presenters. Excellent information. Really thankful to everybody with their questions. Fantastic. Just keep them coming. And, you know, it will take time for everyone to understand both topics. But we're here to provide this on a monthly show. We will continue to keep providing the information that we are with an extra step.
Well, I think one thing that we're seeing right now in the evolution is this: there's so many great experts out there providing great value like this, trying to help as many organizations, as many people as they can stay protected with as much information as they have, right? So I think it's so important to have experts like Mark, Chris, yourself, all these people online to be able to just keep educating, because it's going to be the education that someone's going to go, I heard that Mark said that, I heard Chris said that, and then we need to start doing that. We need to look deeper. And that's what's going to change their security posture, their program, and just help them.
Well, over and beyond that, something that I would like to actually let people know is that the Cybersecurity Global Alliance officially went live today. And the Cybersecurity Global Alliance mandate is to work with members across the world to create global cybersecurity defense in-depth programs for government, military, and corporations to protect themselves from malicious threat actors no matter where they are in the world. Our members are leaders in the cybersecurity industry focused on cross-collaboration and global security initiatives, and are constantly evolving. The CSGA members are dedicated to learn, grow, and provide in our community. Luckily, we have had 7 board members in here today, and I'm glad to say that this is a membership-based not-for-profit under Terra Nova Defense NFP. We have over 16 members from 5 countries being represented, and we are moving into the areas of cyber law and compliance, and cyber think tank possibilities, and working in finally getting together and globalizing our efforts in creating laws that will matter to cybersecurity.
Awesome. I think it's a great initiative. I mean, I think we need to have a global initiative like this, and there's ones out there, but the more we have that combine and work together, the more we're going to be able to protect, internationally, worldwide, that, someone does something over in Europe and then in Canada, affects someone in Canada, that we have these international laws, right? Versus now, someone does something overseas, well, good luck, too bad, right? You just have to deal with it.
And I guess the last thing worth mentioning is our website. If everybody wants to go and check it out, it is csga-global.org. Please
Awesome.
check it out.
Awesome, James. So any last thoughts?
Last thoughts. Again, everyone, be careful out there. You'll be seeing on the news and information, LinkedIn and other sources, that attacks are becoming much more common. We are creating information that is vital for people to know and be aware of. And again, it doesn't hurt to ask if you don't know. If you don't know certain people or so on, Brandon and I are here to help. And everybody that comes onto our show, their contacts, their information. We also have an archive of video bases. So please just ask, and we're here to help anytime.
Yeah. Now, if you guys are seeing this video, or someone that wants to see it, again, go to the YouTube channel, right? Check that out, send it out to your colleagues, send it out to your friends, make sure you get this information out. This is free information. We're here to kind of help you guys look at your security posture, your security program, your security education, just to make sure that you have as much information you have, to make sure that you have the defense in depth, as in this is why it's called, posture and programs, to be able to protect yourself. So James, thank you so much.
Brandon, thank you. Great evening.
Awesome. And you guys, don't forget, we're going to be around next month for the next chat. If you guys don't know where to find it, we've got our meetup group. Connect with the James or myself or any of the the speakers there. They'll lead us to us, and we'll get you back to our meetup group where you can sign up. You'll get notifications, and then you'll be able to see who we have for the speakers for next month. So thank you so much, guys. Hope you have a great night.
Great job, all. Thank you.